Fellow booktube, my name is Carrie and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my January wrap up. So to start off, I'm going to go over some statistics for my reading in January. First, I read 20 books, 5 of which were young adult fantasy, 5 of which were literary fiction, 2 of those were translated, 3 classics, 2 of which were translated, 2 nonfiction, 1 was a memoir and 1 was a social cultural study, 2 short story collections, 1 adult fantasy, 1 YA romance, and 1 poetry collection, which was also translated. So I did really good this month, way more than I expected to read, especially because I read so much back in December, which I didn't even do a wrap up on because it was like over 25 books. So yeah, it was way too much in December and I was surprised that I kind of kept the momentum in January. The first couple weeks of being back in grad school haven't been too intense, so I think that's how I've been able to keep the pace. Yeah, I'm really happy with that, especially because I've been reading from different genres. I was on a big fantasy kick and also reading a lot of translated works because I do like to keep a good percentage of my reading as translated works. So the format that I read these books in, 70% were audiobook and 30% were physical format. And my average rating was a 3.35 stars, which is relatively low, but not surprising because this month I had a lot of up and downs with reading and quite a few disappointments that contributed to that low rating. That low average rating. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started on the actual books. So the first book that I listened to this month was The Winter of the Witch by Katherine Arden, which is narrated by Kathleen Gati, who is one of my favorite narrators. So this is the final book in the Winter Night trilogy, which I read the first 2 books in December and just didn't get around to this final one before the year ended. I did enjoy this. I think that it wrapped up some loose ends, but I feel like it was almost overplotted. There was too much trying to be done. The pacing started off really fast and then slowed down substantially. And while those parts of the story that were slower, we are getting more of the backstory of Vastia's family and getting some of those conflicts that I thought were going to be bigger conflicts of the novel. No, they're actually broken down into smaller ones that were way less impactful. When we get to what the author considered the climax of the story, I didn't really care about this plot line that she threw in, and I was really shocked in the author's note that this was like what she considered the most important part of this story because it was the smallest section of the story. It was like 1.5 chapters maybe, and it just didn't really add anything to the actual like storyline that we had been building up for 3 books. I do feel like there was a good amount of character development in this story and exploring more of the magical world. And I think that Kathleen Arden certainly is a very talented writer. I do really enjoy her writing style and especially the themes that she's explored throughout this series. She was just trying to do too much in this last book and it wasn't coming together that well. I ended up giving this one a 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin Ali. This was translated from the Turkish by Maureen and Alexander Dawe, and this is a Turkish classic that is about a man who he becomes very close to a new coworker of his, and suddenly he's on his deathbed and he is giving this coworker a notebook that explains kind of the biggest secrets of his life and why he really is the way that he is. And so the coworker is determined to read it before the man dies to fully understand this coworker for the first time. This was a really interesting story. It took me a while to get invested in it. I think just because I really wasn't understanding why this man was so odd. And once I finally got that, I was so invested in the story and I became very emotionally attached to this story when we're hitting those big moments where these big reveals are happening and everything really comes together. I will say that I do think Sabahattin Ali had a very beautiful writing style. I think that Maureen and Alexander Dawe's translation is beautiful. And something that I also really liked is that this was a very sharp social commentary on post-World War I Berlin, but also we kind of get another social commentary on Turkey as well and this new Turkish state post-World War I, because both Turkey and Germany experienced a very different political social environment post World War I, and I think that it was really interesting to kind of compare and contrast those with the parts of the story where he was in Germany versus in Turkey and how he kind of reckoned his sense of identity between those two places. Yeah, it was just such a beautiful story, and I think a very underrated classic. I ended up giving this one a 5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook of Passing by Nella Larsen, which was narrated by Tessa Thompson. This is a classic of Harlem Renaissance literature that is about these two friends, one named Irene, who is white passing but has married a black man, lives her life as a black woman. She is very active and involved in the black community and in uplifting black people. The other friend is named Claire. Claire is white passing, and she considers herself to be a white woman to the extent that she marries a white man who is extremely racist and has no idea that Claire is a black woman. From the get-go, you can tell that there's tension here. There's tension between Claire and her husband, but also slowly over the novel, we explore this tension between Claire and Irene, who have been friends in childhood. They're reconnected through this chance encounter, and Claire is constantly putting Irene in the middle of her business, sometimes even in like potential harm's way with things or disrupting Irene's life, while Claire expects Irene just to go along with it just because Claire doesn't understand why someone would be tired of dealing with her crap. I really love the character of Irene. I think that it was really interesting to see how she was processing things, how she was very frustrated with Claire, but also had this sense of community with Claire because they did grow up together. I didn't like Claire at all. I think that that somewhat hindered my rating of this because I found Claire to be so annoying. I thought that she was very shallow and selfish, and I also felt like there wasn't a ton of development that we got of her character. So yeah, I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This was one that was like really popular a few years ago, but since then I haven't heard anything about it, and I'm truly shocked by that because this book ended up being one of my absolute favorites. I think probably will be in my like top 10 of 2022, which is bold to say right now, but I was so attached to this story. But to give a little summary, it's a story about a Chinese American family who's living in small town Ohio, and one day one of the daughters disappears. She's the middle child, she's the golden child of this family, and she just disappears. And then her body is found, and this family is kind of left with the aftermath of that, trying to figure out how to understand what happened to her and how they missed whatever was going on. This is a character-driven novel, specifically more of a character examination, where we're examining these 4 other family members and how they are processing what happened to this daughter and sister. I liked that this family was flawed. I liked that they were frustrating at times. They could be selfish and could also completely misinterpret something in a memory, where we eventually get to see the other person's side, and we see how this miscommunication leads to so much resentment and so much that's unsaid. I think that this kind of reflects human nature. I mean, we can only really look back on a memory from our own perspective. We have both verbal and nonverbal communication, but it's up to us to interpret that correctly. And I think that this showed how, especially in families that have generational trauma, there's like an added layer to that miscommunication, where there's also like generational, social, and cultural differences that contribute to that. I think that the alternating perspectives between all of the family members and also even Lydia herself was really interesting because we get to see all of the perspectives on a moment, and that's something that unfortunately the characters couldn't see. And I believe that this is where Celeste Ng's writing really shined through, because she showed how multifaceted the human experience is and how family dynamics like this are, and how someone is an individual member of a family, but also there's this collective identity as a family that doesn't always align with the individual, and I really appreciated that. Something else that I thought was really interesting was the author's choice to set this novel in the 1970s, which is a time that many white people thought were very progressive. Shows the kind of hypocrisy of that, because the experiences of these characters are not progressive. They are not directly benefiting from these progressive times, and in actuality, there was a lot of reckoning ahead. I liked that the author set this story in the past in a way that was non-exploitative. It was not just to bring up racism. I think it was mainly to give the author the space to explore issues that affected this family in great detail through a generational lens. My final gush about this book is that I really love how this story portrays grief. I think it is very authentic to the grieving experience, and I think I especially appreciate that it shows sibling grief, which is often not represented in stories of grief or is very poorly represented, and I think that this gives a very realistic portrayal of that, and I really appreciated seeing that in a book. So 5 out of 5 stars, absolute favorite. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Just One Day by Gayle Foreman, which was narrated by Kathleen McInerney. So this is the story of a girl named Allison who she's on this trip to Europe as her like pre-college trip, and she meets this guy. They decide to go to Paris for just one day, and she kind of falls for him. He disappears. She spends the rest of the novel trying to figure out what happened to him. There were so many things that frustrated me about this novel. First and foremost, the naivety of Allison and how she just really did not understand how privileged she was, that everybody else took care of her problems. She would genuinely get frustrated with people when they wouldn't do like what she wanted or solve her problem for her, and that was the most infuriating thing. She just didn't realize how lucky she was, and then tried to make this whole thing of like she was struggling to go back to Paris on her own. But the thing is that she was doing all of that just to go back to see this guy. Every motivation that she had was to get back to Paris to see this guy or find him or whatever. And it just was dumb. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, I can understand where the red flags look a little green in a situationship, but girl, let it go. Get a grip. It was just very, very whiny. I ended up giving that one 1 out of 5 stars. Then I read and listened to the audiobook of The Map of Salt and Stars by Zeyn Joukhadar, and the narrator for this was Lara. Sawalha. So this is the story of a girl named Noor who at the beginning of the novel, she's lost her father, I believe to cancer, and her mom decides that it's best for her and her sisters to move back to Syria where they have family rather than stay in the US. Except for, oh yeah, Syria's in the middle of a civil war and things don't go as her mother planned. Why did the mother move them back to Syria? That is never really fully explained throughout this story, because as it turns out, they only have one family member still in Syria, and it just did not make sense to me. I could not realistically understand why this mother knew that there was a civil war going on in Syria and took her children. Also, there's another like story being told within this story. So basically, Nora's father used to read her this bedtime story or tell her this bedtime story about this woman who pretends to be a boy to go on these grand adventures. So that story is told in the introduction to each chapter, which did not connect well to the actual story. That story was set in the past. It had a lot of fantasy elements. It was actually very interesting. Like, I would read a book solely on that story or one solely on Nora's story, but together they did not work. And the connections that the author tries to make were not there. They were not well connected in any way, shape, or form, and it felt forced. I didn't like it. I also didn't really understand the age range of this novel because Noor is, I would say, around like middle grade. The themes in her story, I would say, would be YA to adult content. And then there's this story in this like fantasy story where it's all adult characters and there are adult themes within that. So I was very confused about what the expected age range or audience of this was because it wasn't being clearly conveyed in the story. Also, the writing was just really weird. The main character had this like whole thing with colors that I thought originally was like the author subtly hinting that she might be autistic. Not at all the case. She just randomly describes things in comparison to colors and also compares things to fruit, which I was not understanding that. Yeah, this just did not work for me on any level. So I gave this one a 1 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Pure Invention by Matt Alt, which is narrated by the author. This is a nonfiction, kind of a cultural history of Japan. It specifically looks at how Japan's culture became such a like world-renowned thing and how certain technology, certain media grew to these cultural icons within Japan itself, but also within the larger world as a whole. I really liked that this author incorporated history, culture, language, and technology into this work. I think that it was a really well-rounded approach to things. And I honestly thought that this was going to be a 5-star read for me until this one chapter, which is called The Antisocial Network. This chapter was not as well developed as other sections, and the connections that were made to other parts of the work, but also to like his larger point in this, were very superficial for me. I think that they just needed a little bit more exploration. Nevertheless, it was a very interesting and engaging read. I think that I learned so much from this book. I feel like anybody could take a lot away from this if they're interested in Japanese cultural stuff. So yeah, really good read. 4 out of 5 stars. This next one is going to be controversial because it is a very well-beloved book, and that is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, which was translated from the Portuguese by Alan R. Clarke. So I know that this is a very beloved book. I bought it because of that, and it sat on my shelves for a number of years, which is partially why I picked it up, because this year I've been trying to work more through the books that have been on my shelves the longest. And this is probably going to end up being on my like biggest disappointments of 2022 list, because I was really let down by this. I had such high hopes. I didn't enjoy the writing style at all. I felt like it was overly simplified. I do wonder if it was a translator's choice rather than the actual story. I don't speak Portuguese, so I won't know for sure. But yeah, I really questioned that because it just felt very odd that there was such simplified language, but then every once in a while we would get this like one quote that was so philosophical. But back to the actual language, I feel like even if you couldn't understand like the language of this, it would beat you over the head by repeating the same things. Repetition in books is my least favorite literary device. I think it is overused and used poorly and just did not work for me in terms of writing. The pacing was all over the place. I feel like there was all this buildup that just gets completely deflated. And then the ending of this book literally made me want to throw my book against the wall. I did not enjoy it because it just showed that so much of this story is so unnecessary. There was no point to this, and I don't like that. That feels like wasted time to me. I did not enjoy this one. 1 out of 5 stars for me. The next 4 books are actually going to be reviewed together because they are the entirety of the Raven cycle by Maggie Stiefvater. So the series starts out with this girl Blue who is born into a family of psychics. She doesn't have any psychic powers herself. She ends up meeting this guy named Gansey on what's called the Corpse Road, which is supposed to be a road where her family compiles a list of people that are going to die within the next year because they encounter their souls. And she meets this guy Gansey on this road, so she knows he's going to die in the next year. Through a set of events, she meets Gansey and his friends, who she refers to as the Raven Boys, because they all go to this really rich elite school that has like a raven symbol. Slowly but surely, they piece together these kind of supernatural events that are happening in this really small town. From there, they go on this big journey to solve this great mystery about this Welsh king that might be connected to these supernatural events. So I gave the first book 4 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed that one. I gave the second book 3 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed the development of Ronan in that one. Did not enjoy Adam in that one at all. Really had issues with that. Blue Lily Lily Blue. Oh, this one was 4 stars. I might honestly bump it up to 4.5 stars because I think this one really was my favorite because it gave me so much of what I wanted from the Dream Thieves, and it was really good. And then the final book I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Overall, I enjoyed the series, but I wasn't absolutely in love with it. I think the author really struggled with creating way too many subplots and also adding in so many unnecessary characters that she didn't do anything with. I do think there was good character development of the 4 main characters, but some of that character development was very slow. I think especially in the case of Blue, Blue didn't receive full character development until book 3, but I feel like Blue needed that development a little bit earlier. And then I think the biggest issue for me was the final book, where, you know, so much was left unanswered. I feel like she really lost the momentum of this plot that we spent 4 books developing. There's this whole new subplot thrown in that I thought was like bringing us back to the main plot, and it didn't. It just like did its own thing, and the main plot I feel like was really lost in this novel. Also, to have left this story open for like more books when it was very clear that this was going to be the last book in this series, the ending felt like a cop-out considering that. It was so frustrating. Yeah, I don't want to rant anymore about it because then I'm gonna get more irritated. But yeah, I was really disappointed with how this series ended. Next, I read Sweet Bean Paste by Dorian Sukagawa, translated from the Japanese by Alison Watts. This is the story of an ex-con named Sentaro who works in this confectionery shop selling these like pastries, I think they technically are, called dorayaki. He hires this woman named Toku who has a physical disability, and that is something that is very heavily stigmatized in Japanese society and culture, as is his background as an ex-con though, which is a part of why he hires her, in addition to the fact that she makes this amazing sweet bean paste that is used in the pastries, which she kind of forces him to try after she tells him, your sweet bean paste is trash. You need to try this actual really nice homemade one. So from there, they form this friendship that is just so sweet and so, I think, impactful, because it shows how people with societal and cultural stigmatizations have to kind of deconstruct those and see the other side. And I think that it was just a really beautiful story. So sweet. It was a very short story, but so impactful for how short it was. I really became invested in these characters, and I think that especially reading the author's note in the end of the book, where the author talks about why he was inspired to write this story, just shows the passion that he had about this subject and about highlighting a part of Japanese society that is often not talked about and often taboo. And yeah, it was just a really good story. I would really highly recommend this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Cinder by Marissa Meyer, narrated by Rebecca Solar, who was an awesome narrator. This is a Cinderella retelling that takes place in this like dystopian futuristic world where there has been a plague that has resulted in like a substantial portion of the population dying. There's like this lunar colony on the moon. Some people are cyborgs, including our main character, Cinder, who has no memory of her past. She lives with this woman who has kind of like unofficially adopted her, I think, and the woman's 2 daughters. And one of the daughters gets sick, and the mom blames Cinder and sends her off to be like basically a lab rat for this illness to try and find antibodies for it. And at the same time, she's working with this handsome prince named Kai, who's trying to get this technology fixed that only Cinder knows how to like properly fix. One of the most interesting things about this novel is the world that it's set in, which is why it baffled me that this received no world building. There's no explanation for how this world became this way besides that there was a plague, but there's no explanation for this advancement in technology, the lunar colony that we hear about, this new Beijing concept, and that there's some other countries, but we don't necessarily know what they are. It just was never explained. So I don't understand really what world this was supposed to be in, because there were very few times that I even realized, oh yeah, this is supposed to be like another alternate universe, basically, which I understand. Yes, there are 3 more books in this series, but that is the foundation of the world. You need that in the first book, so I really don't understand why it wasn't included. Also, the characters felt really flat for me. There was no real development of Kai. I didn't find him interesting except for in the scenes where he's with Cinder. And honestly, I didn't really care that much for Cinder either. She was so slow to put things together. I actually cared more about the villain's origin story than Cinder's. I was just really underwhelmed with this, and I don't think that I'm gonna continue with it because, yeah, I gave this one 2 out of 5 stars, so meh. Next, I listened to the audiobook of If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha, which was narrated by Frances Cha, Sujin Kim, Ruthie Ann Miles, and Gina Yi. All amazing narrators. And this is the story of 4 women who live in the same apartment building in, I believe, the capital city of South Korea. They all come from very different backgrounds and are experiencing very different things. But the overarching point of this story is that all 4 women serve as a means of social commentary on issues that affect women in South Korea, mainly the societal expectations of women in South Korea, the beauty standards, and the increase in plastic surgery. And I'm gonna say from the bat that if you're going into this expecting there to be a really engaging plot, there's not. This is another story that is a character examination. This book has received quite a number of mixed reviews, and a lot of the ones that I was reading through were saying that there was no plot to this novel. It was all just about the characters, or they were saying that they like didn't feel like the story was going anywhere. But I completely disagree with that. I think that the point of this story was the characters, and I think that it was going somewhere because it was deconstructing the different parts of society that shaped their experiences. And I think that this is most evident through the themes that we explore through these women of sex work, violence, socioeconomic exploitation, and infertility, on top of a ton of other things that are explored throughout these women's lives. It was just so interesting, and I felt like I was really in the minds of these characters. I understood how they were viewing something and why they were viewing it that way. And my two favorite characters were Ara and Kyori. They were much more observational than the other two women. They understood how society was like reflecting back on them, whereas the other two women were reflecting on like their internal processing of things. And so I thought that that was also a very interesting comparison and contrast in the story, was that we're getting these two people who are much more externally focused, whereas these other two are internally focused, but they all still overlap in so many areas. I felt that all four characters were important to the story, and I think that they brought unique perspectives to the story as a whole. Also, my final like gushing about this is that I have to highlight the writing style in this, because this is Frances Cha's debut. Beautiful writing, so well written, and the way that she chose first person narration for these stories felt like she was giving the power to the characters, giving them a voice instead of someone from the outside looking in. And I really appreciated that narration style. And I really am looking forward to whatever she puts out next, because I think that she is a very talented writer. So I ended up giving that one 4 to 5 stars. I think I would rate it to 4.5 stars actually, because it's a book that the longer that I've sat with it, the more I have enjoyed it. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford, which was narrated by the author. This is a bit difficult to describe because the way that it's marketed is very wrong. It's not accurate to the story. Basically, this is a nonfiction memoir that's about the author's childhood, and specifically about the relationships with her family that shaped that childhood. The first thing that really stuck out to me is this tension in the mother-daughter relationship that we see right from the beginning of the memoir. I think that it really shows how complicated family dynamics blur the lines of what we really consider right and wrong. I think the way that this author explains the very complex dynamics of her family, and specifically of getting to really know both of her parents, was very interesting. I think that it highlights the process of first coming to terms with the fact that our parents are very multifaceted people. They're not just our parents, and also how we really build up our parents in our minds. And sometimes we're setting expectations of who they are, who they're supposed to be, that are not reflective of who they genuinely are and what they're genuinely capable of. I loved how the author deconstructs her other relationships with family members and friends who had an influence on her when she was growing up. The way that she recognized that her other family members were both a big part of her support system and where she definitely turned to for emotional needs, but also simultaneously how they and her parents shaped some problematic views that she had about herself, specifically about herself as a young Black woman coming of age and being hypersexualized by society and by her own family. The author shows how that affected her in the long term of her development, and I thought that it was really interesting how she deconstructed that throughout this narrative. And also acknowledging that these are her interpretations of memories and events. I think that is a really important point to make in a story like this, to acknowledge that different people might have seen things in a different way, and that doesn't make their perspective wrong. It just means that we had different sides to the story, which is an excellent way to approach something like this topic. I only really had 2 criticisms of this work. The first of which is when we find out what her father did that put him in jail, I feel like his story really changed in the sense that he was largely cut from the narrative and it's not really explored, especially not in the ways that it intersects with the author's story. That's one where I almost hesitate to harp on about this, because I feel like a part of it might be that the author herself hasn't processed that fully, hasn't fully worked through that very startling revelation. However, it seems odd that that would be revealed in the story and not pursued further, considering some of the other things that have happened later after that that are explored more. So I'm not really sure about that one. My only other critique is that I felt like the portion of the story that takes place in her last year of college to post-college were just really fast-paced compared to other parts of the story. I felt like it was like a blink of an eye and we were suddenly years ahead, and I would have liked for those sections to, I think, been taken a little bit slower. However, I still think that the narrative was clear, the major themes were clear throughout the work, even with those sections feeling like they were more rapidly paced. I gave it a 4 to 5 stars. Next, I read The White Book by Han Kang, which is translated from the Korean by Deborah Smith. This is a poetry collection focused on Han Kang's time living in Warsaw, where she reflects on the life that was never lived by her sister, her older sister who died shortly after birth. And this was a beautiful collection. I felt really invested in these poems, and it's just beautiful writing. This is one of those books where there were so many parts that I underlined, annotated, like tabbed. My physical copy is up here, which is full of tabs. But yeah, it was just, I loved this collection. I think that this really solidified that Han Kang is one of my favorite authors. 5 out of 5 stars on my favorites. Yeah, great read. Next, I listened to 5 Tuesdays in Winter by Lily King. This was narrated by a full voice cast that I'm going to list below because there were like 8 stories in this, so I'm not going to list them out. This is a collection of short stories that cover a spectrum of human experiences, and this was a little bit darker in tone than I thought it would be. I think that Lily King and I just do not get on in terms of writing style. I don't know why. There's just something about her writing that I really struggle to connect with. I think that was very evident in seeing so many variations of her writing style in this, where there were really big hits in this collection, but some that were just absolute misses for me. I think that this really perfectly highlights how short story collections really struggle with cohesiveness, with being able to develop well-rounded characters and story arcs. And in the ones that didn't work for me, those were very big problems with those stories. I feel like the stories that dealt with the 2 darkest themes for me, I didn't really understand why she made them so graphically disturbing. It felt like she was just trying to like disgust the reader. I just had a number of issues with the ones that I didn't get on with in this collection. The 2 that were my favorite from this collection, because I did find 2 that I actually did really enjoy. One was 5 Tuesdays in Winter because it's a nice romance with all the cozy feels, and then the other was When in the Dordogne, which is a really interesting portrayal of coming of age and male friendship that I did enjoy as well. Those are the 2 gems for me. There were a couple that were like average, but there were a number that fell at like 1 star for me. So not exactly the greatest. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Philyaw, narrated by Janina Edwards. And this is a short story collection that is about people who go to church or who had childhoods that were shaped by the church, and kind of explores the hypocrisies of a lot of church-going people and the lives that they lead outside of church that would shock a lot of people, I think. And it also explores a lot of identity issues that are related to religion, which is something that was very interesting to see over the course of these stories. I really loved this collection. These stories were so well developed. In almost every story, I felt very invested in the characters. My favorite story was How to Make Love to a Physicist, because I'm a sucker for a slow burn romance, as evidenced in 5 Tuesdays in Winter. Also, this one explores more of the kind of philosophical discussions around religion and the spiritual discussions around religion. And it was just really interesting. I really liked these 2 characters, and the way that this story kind of unfolds was just really great for me. I only knocked this collection down a half a star to 4.5 stars out of 5 stars because of this one story that's called Not Daniel. It was very short. It was like 6 minutes in total of the audiobook. And on the one hand, I guess I could argue that maybe it was short to highlight the fast pace that this specific thing needed to take, considering the circumstances. But it just didn't really work for me. I felt like there wasn't really character development. There's like one plot point to the whole thing, and it happened, and it was just like, oh, okay, that's it. Yeah, that one just didn't work for me in the same way as the others, but the other ones I found very impactful, very emotional. There were points where I laughed out loud in this story. There were points where I was literally on the edge of tears. Really great collection, and I look forward to whatever else Disha Philyaw puts out, because great writing. The final book that I read this month is probably the most disappointing one for me personally and my interests, and that is At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, and it is translated from the French by Anna Muskovakis and narrated by Dion Graham, because I listened to this on audio. So this is the story of a man who is a Senegalese soldier for the French army in World War I, and after witnessing the death of one of his closest friends in war, he slowly descends into madness, basically losing his mind, and we follow him on this journey throughout the story. I think that this especially disappointed me because I went into this book with a lot of background context. I've previously read Memoirs of a Maelstrom, which is a non-fiction oral history of Senegalese World War I troops and about their experiences in World War I. So I knew a substantial amount about how Senegalese troops had been treated in World War I, the experiences with PTSD, other mental health issues after the war, and the complete lack of resources provided to them, and also the dehumanization of them because they were colonial troops. Like, some of them weren't even given like boots, or they were given malfunctioning weapons because they were used as cannon fodder, really. And yeah, amazing nonfiction oral history that I would really recommend to people. For this book, I was entering it with that context in mind, and I was so excited for this story because it is from a Senegalese author who is writing about Senegalese history. And colonial history is very largely ignored in the literature stemming from World War I. So was really excited for this one. Sadly, there were just a number of things that didn't work for me in this. First, I will go over the few things that did work for me. I thought that it portrayed the chaos of war well, the dehumanization of colonial troops, and the treatment of mental illness and trauma in the war. I felt like those were well explored in this. Honestly, considering how that was interwoven through the beginning of the story, I felt like there was a strong introduction to this book. The first half of the book was really good for me. I felt like I could somewhat understand the main character and his motivations and his struggles. And I felt like there was a somewhat clear narrative of where things were going. Sadly, the second half of this book just went off the rails. It jumps around in time where there's not a clear timeline of things. Events are getting jumbled up. It felt like chunks of a story or snippets of a story, and then we're jumping on to the next thing, and it was just very jarring. I think that for what the author was trying to explore, it just needed a better way of doing these flashbacks, because I think what the author intended to do was make it feel like memories that were coming back to this soldier. But it didn't feel like that. Yeah, it just wasn't coming together cohesively. My biggest criticism is the repetition in this book. It is a less than 150-page book that repeats this one phrase over 100 times. I ended up counting because it was happening so frequently. That is unnecessary. And it's especially infuriating when the second half of this book needed a more cohesive and clear timeline, needed better character development, needed more structured writing than it had, and instead of, you know, editing and honing in on those details, there's just all this repetition. And it wasn't just one phrase, there were multiple phrases that were constantly repeated, and it was just so frustrating because I was like, had you focused on the actual elements of the story, this could have been so much better done. All that wasted space on repeating the same things over and over again could have been providing us with context for why this death drove this character over the edge. Why was it so impactful? Because I didn't really feel like this friendship was as big of a deal as it's made out to be, because we didn't get a lot of that backstory. We got this one man's backstory, but it wasn't a lot of intersection with how this friend of his, who's supposed to be more than a brother, became so important to him. And yeah, I think that there were just a lot of structural issues in the second half. It just really underwhelmed me. I feel like this was a story that had so much potential, especially with the way that the first half started, but it just lost its footing completely. So that might not have been the best way to end January, but nevertheless, I still feel like I found some really great reads in this first month of the year, and I'm really looking forward to my February reads. I will be doing a TBR video for that. But yeah, so those are all of the books that I read in January. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video, and if you read any of these books, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and happy reading. Bye!